And we are amazed always at your creation and at your awesome power and display, Father, everywhere we look. Father, you got us through another week, and we thank you so much for that. And you carried us when we needed help, Father. And sometimes, Father, our stubborn will, we went places we didn't need to go. We did things we didn't need to do. And Father, forgive us for those things. Father, open our eyes, our hearts, and our minds to see the challenges around us, to look for opportunities to serve and glorify you. Lord, we ask that you be with us today as in the study, that we look into your word and look for the qualities, the qualifications, the kinds of men that you would have serve in your church as shepherds. Father, help us to see these things. Help us all then to take these qualities to heart and put them into practice in our daily walk. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to be in Matthew 20, and also there's a similar account in Mark 10. So if you want to compare those two accounts at some point, you can do that. One of the things we're going to look at today is the shepherd's authority. You know, and so the questions that are on the screen there are apt. That's kind of what we want to do. You know, our current view, our current paradigm, if you will, with regard to leadership is not so much different than it was in Jesus' time. You know, there was that occasion here in Matthew 20 where Matthew says that James and John's mother went to Jesus and said, hey, can you give to my sons, to James and John, this special place in the kingdom? Mark doesn't record the fact that it was James's and John's mother that did that. Whether he's being kind to her or for whatever reason, he apparently didn't think that was, or didn't think that was as important a part of the story. But and it really almost doesn't matter, I guess, in a lot of ways. But what it does do is it kind of highlights the idea that we all kind of have with regard to what we expect, what we look for in leaders. And it does, whether we like to admit it or not, it does sort of have a tendency to find its way into the church. And so we want to look at, you know, answer the questions, what is the view that Jesus promoted for leaders? And how do we put that into practice in that is that example that he led of servant leadership? Because it certainly was 180 degrees out from what the world thought of leaders. Kind of reminds you there of the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus would say, you've heard it said, but I say. So it's kind of that way in a way. He says, okay, here's what the world thinks of leadership, but here's what I'm going to tell you it should be. And so there's a contrast, a distinction, if you will, between these leadership styles that we should aspire to. Let me get caught up on what did I do with my... No, I've got it in my pocket or somewhere. Figure out where I put things. Here we go. Sherry says I should give up having pockets. All right, listen. So one of the things we want to talk about here is the idea that the church is a living organism, if you will. It's not an organization. We don't need a board of directors. Jesus certainly didn't have that in mind when he established his church. Shepherds, on the other hand, knew what they had to do when tending to their flocks, right? And this was an imagery that was probably more vivid, I guess, for the disciples than it is for us, because how many of you guys raise sheep or know a whole lot about sheep? I know nothing about sheep except that we get wool from them. And sometimes when you go to the inn, you can get a good sandwich, you know. That's about all I know about sheep. But it was vivid for them because they understood the imagery. They understood that shepherds guard the flock. They understood that shepherds, come on, you can do it. Okay, it's not working there, Doug. I don't know. Did I turn it off? I don't think so. Oh, there we go. Now we got them all. That's okay. So they know their sheep. They lead the flock in places they need to be, not necessarily always where they want to go. You know, it was the sheep that went off on his own, that went where he wanted to go, that was lost. It was the sheep that wandered away, that had to be rescued. And so shepherds will lead the flock where it needs to be, to the right kind of pastures, to the right kind of water, to ensure that their needs are met. And then, of course, shepherds understand, there's a chief shepherd that they answer to. And in the church, our shepherds also have a chief shepherd. And we'll make that point a little bit later on. But that chief shepherd is Jesus. So if there is a CEO, if you will, in the church, that position's taken. We don't need to look for a CEO, COO, what all the other terms are for the heads of businesses. Jesus has got that one taken care of. So how does culture then influence how we see our shepherds, how we see our elders, and how they function? What do you think? Okay.
It's not described in the Bible at all. They built this hierarchy that their individual congregations are not autonomous. They answer to these higher ups that tell them who their shepherds are going to be, i.e. their bishops.
Yeah. Okay. So Ken describes then a hierarchy that developed over time of chief and underlings and such. Tommy?
There's a statement that says a great leader is one that not asked for the job, but found that the job was thrust upon them. It was a situation where they did not really want to be there. They didn't want the praise of it. It wasn't about leadership. It was about what needed to be done.
Okay.
And you can look at Patton. Patton was initially given command to be actually a ruse to help the real strike go in there.
Mm-hmm.
But Patton just did not care about what the higher ups thought of it. He went and just got done what needed to be done.
Yeah.
So if you have an eldership that knows that something needs to happen, but he's worried about what the congregation may think of him, and he's worried to offend or step on other people's toes, that's not quite what we really need. We need someone to explain to the congregation, this is what the Bible says. We're going to have to follow this and go that way by walking on glass shoes.
Yeah, a lot of times we do, and what Tommy's saying is that sometimes leadership, positions of authority are thrust onto people. It's not something necessarily they sought or whatever, but being there, they did what was necessary without regard necessarily to what, who might have their feelings hurt or who thought what. They just pressed on, and sometimes they explained what they're doing and sometimes they didn't. George wasn't one for a lot of explanation, I think. Yep. Okay, so here our view sometimes I think has been influenced by politics, our government, whatever, the Constitution, if you will, and so we think of democracies, democratic republics, things like that, and so yeah, we do kind of get consensus and all, Generally, though, when we look at leaderships, we look at people who, or what we desire, I think sometimes, is we look for someone who's going to be assertive, someone who's going to take control, someone who's going to make decisions, going to be decisive and move out, okay? Sometimes like George Patton, where he doesn't really care, what his hierarchy thinks.
Some years ago, we had gone to 3 types of Protestant churches.
What kind of churches?
They call it Protestant.
Okay, all right.
The first type is, I think it's called Lutheran or Episcopal
Uh-huh.
type. And that's the one where one person is in charge, and everybody reports to that one person. Second type is called Presbyterian, which is where the congregation is run by a group of what are called elders. And then the third type is called Congregationalist, I believe. And that's where all major decisions, if you had one, you just all meet together,
Mhm.
and then you kind of vote on it.
Okay.
So we did it, we did it 3 times, of course, we're elders. But I wonder if that's still one of the categories today. You have just a one leader, group of elders, or congregationalists for everybody.
I think if you looked out, what Bill is saying there, that basically there's 3 types of congregations. Ones that have a single leader, some that are ruled by a group of elders, and then some that are kind of a consensus building across the congregation. And I think that's probably pretty, apt description sometimes of all. Of course, there's exceptions to everything, right? But when we think of leaders, we are thinking of folks that are decisive and carrying out, and just, we kind of want, well, not that we want, but I think sometimes we expect our elders to be the law. We look for the executive. Sometimes we want them to wear the striped shirts and throw the yellow flags and blow the whistle. We want them to catch the rules, infractions, and enforce the penalties, right? Or we think as doctors, they can fix stuff. They can heal. They can make things right. And sometimes we want them to be more judicial. We want them to be the arbiters of right and wrong. What does the law say? And so we want them to be in that role. And then sometimes we want them to be first responders. We want them to roll in here and put out the fires. We expect almost these things. Tommy? Say that now.
We want them to be forceful,
Yep.
but we want them to be forceful within the guidelines of the law.
Yeah. Every time he says we want our shepherds to be forceful, but within the constraints or in the guidelines of what God's word says. And I think that's good. I think we do want that. That's not an abuse, I think, or a bending, but there's some other things we need, and I think what Christ wants us to have is a little bit different than any of these images that might bring to mind. When you have these kinds of leaders, I should say these kind, so I'm looking that way. You got folks that are using the ox goad or perhaps the carrot, and so you're pushing, you're prodding, you're getting things moving. You're not necessarily leading. Same thing with the carrot. And so how we see these, how these play out in the church. Excuse me. The fall pollen is killing me. So what do you think that a shepherd might have in his toolkit, or maybe in his desk drawer, or laying around in his office? What are some ideas of things you might see in a shepherd's or an elder's space? A Bible, okay. Go ahead, Kent, what?
I said, yeah, hopefully the word of God.
Okay, Bible, yeah. Anything else? What about these things, okay? Multiple translations, all right. And I say that also with a word of caution. We have a lot of versions of the Bibles out there. You need to know whether you're looking at a translation or a paraphrase. And so some of our translations are better than others. And so take a look, be prudent about that. Some are better in some areas, and so there are strong points to probably all of them. But know exactly what you're looking at, and don't be afraid to go back, pull your Greek lexicon off the desk or off the shelf, and ensure that the words that you're reading what you think they do, okay? And so, yeah, you'd find that. Maybe a pictorial directory. You know, shepherds need to know the sheep. Sometimes we get new members and perhaps an elder's out of town when someone shows up and we don't know who they are. So being able to refresh your memory and put a name with a face is important. Maybe a prayer list. Soft carpet to kneel on, unless you just have tough knees. How about notes from children? You know, those little thank you notes, the happy birthday notes, the hey, this is what I was thinking this week, what do you think? You know, kinds of notes. How about notes from members of the congregation? To encourage, to say, hey, hang in there. I know things are rough right now, but you can get through this with our help and God's help. How about cards to send, you know? Telephone, computer, Kleenex perhaps? And of course you're going to need some painkiller. maybe you don't. An eraser. It's so important to be able to erase mistakes, right? None of us is perfect. I think we've made the point in here that we're all clay vessels, and we're not. Elders are not perfect, and certainly we are not. Something that makes you laugh, you know, just something that's going to break the tension. Sometimes it just diverts what's going on. And a mirror, not so you can admire, but so you can do some self-inspection, examination, and say, okay, am I being what I should be? Bill?
It's all about.
Mm-hmm.
She went back into town, talking to people, and you remember what she said? In a lesson, she said, come see somebody who knows all about it.
Yeah.
That was what was the key factor of someone who's, I'll say, leadership. And I feel that the person knows about it, understands my problem, and what I need.
Exactly. To be able to. Mm-hmm. You can't do that unless you get to know folks. But we also need to know ourselves that well. You know, I'm painfully aware of my weaknesses, and you probably all are too. And I know that we are all our worst critics, because sometimes we can discourage ourselves out of doing things we ought to do because I can't do that. We kind of sound more like Aaron than we do anything else. And so we need to be careful about that, but we also do need to do some self-inspection. The towel here, we're going to talk about a little bit, but the towel's not for, maybe you need to wipe off the sweat off your brow, I don't know. But no, the towel I'm talking about here is the towel that we wrap around and wash the feet of our brothers and sisters. And so there ought to be a towel there too. Does that make sense? Are those things you think, and maybe you think of something else that might be helpful for a shepherd to have in his desk. So, what kind of authority then does a shepherd exercise? We've kind of highlighted the worldview, that of the authoritarian, sometimes the tyrant. Sometimes, I'm the chief and you're not, and so just do what I say because I have the authority. There's that kind of leadership. But what do you think that we are looking for really? What are the two views in the church today? Well, really, we would boil these down, probably oversimplifying a little bit. But honestly, they have no authority except that derived from their example and their faithful experience. This comes from Everett Ferguson's article that, goodness, what year did he write that? Last century anyway, but it doesn't mean it's less true. Okay, so we really don't have a lot of authority, or elders don't, except that derived from their own example and faithful experience. When people see how they live and say, wow, that's someone I could follow, that's someone I could listen to. And of course, elders have delegated authority in the local church to fulfill those obligations of overseer, pastor, bishop, elder. Now, I know Steve could probably speak to this better than I can, but there are some requirements. For instance, and this, I probably should have mentioned this back in that part where we were talking about board of directors. But by law, we have to have a board, or Steve, what's it called? Well, not a board of directors, but you know when you establish a yes, officers, yes. Mhm. Yeah, and so that has to be on a piece of paper to satisfy the legal requirements for, yeah, and so we have that, but it's only for us to satisfy the requirements of the law. That's not really a functional part of the church. So, but still, as an overseer, pastor, bishop, elder, all those terms are interchangeable, right? There are some obligations, some responsibilities that we have that do require some exercise of authority, however you want to say that. Steve?
In addition to all the other things they need, elders need a sense of a level of business acumen, because you've got to fulfill the requirements of the state of Florida, incorporating the state of Florida.
And the church is a business.
But you know, obviously there's financial and other financial obligations they have to have. So, and I'm sure we've all seen it. If you're a certain age, you've got the greatest elder in the world with zero business acumen, and it costs.
Yeah.
It costs more than money. It costs in other areas. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then you gotta have some that have great business acumen and they're really bad people.
Well, either you have that, if you couldn't hear Steve, there's sometimes in the church you do need that expertise, and he's pointing or speaking for Louise there. So there's some expertise, I suppose, that is needed in order to direct the business, if you will, of the church. Yeah, but we also have a whole lot of smart people around that know those kinds of things, and so I'm a horrible carpenter, for instance. So, but I'll get a hammer and a saw, and I'll go out there and try to do some stuff. But if I'm smart, I'll get someone who knows how to carpenter to come take on those things. And so we can reach out and get the expertise that we need. Sometimes I don't necessarily have to be the expert. I don't do public math. If I need some public math done, I'll talk to David. I'm sorry, go over here first, Tommy.
I think several churches, and when the elders, you see some elders that just have a knack of knowing what's going on, especially with troubled members of their flock.
Okay.
In other words, they know that this person's got a problem and this person's got a problem. And I know that through my years, I was terrible at that. I would sit there and someone would say, well, you know, they have this problem going on and they could use some help in this. And I'm like, oh, when did that happen? Oh, well, it's been going on for 3 years. I mean, I was always the last to know of what was going on. But there is a type of person that has an ear to the ground and actually knows what's going on with the sheep to be able to help them.
That's true. Sometimes people are plugged in enough to be able to almost read body language. I didn't tell you that. How do you know that? Well, I could just see that something's going on. Brian?
Examples that the apostles gave in Acts of recognizing where the most needful things were for them to participate in. They appointed deacons for the purpose of fulfilling a lot of the work that is important to the church.
Sure.
But it wasn't the most important things for them to focus on. So when I think we look at that example, elders often have the responsibility to recognize, hey, I probably shouldn't do this myself. I should involve somebody that has the skills and the ability so that I can stay focused on the things that are most important.
That's true, and that's exactly what was going on there in Acts, was it 6, 7, where they had the Hellenistic widows who were overlooked and were in need, and they said, "Hey, we don't need to be doing this. Search out some men from within your number that can take care of this. And then they delegated then to them this responsibility to do that so that they could go ahead and do the kinds of things that the elders and the apostles needed to be focused on. And so that's true even within the church. So a lot of times, you've probably heard it said that a lot of times elders are doing the work of the deacons are doing the work of the church, and the rest of everybody's not doing much at all. And so we need to change that kind of paradigm too as we look through what's going on within the church. So we want to continue this. Let's go back now to Matthew. I don't know, before we get to that. Tommy South in his material, he talks about these terms from the Greek that are used, but he points out that these are never used in the New Testament along with the terms that we use for elder, shepherd, etc. And so we have these kinds of exousia. I don't know, I probably have to rely on Ross for pronunciation of these Greek kinds of things. That is a controlling authority. The dynamis, power, despotes, master. You can see where you get despot from there. And archon, that ruling authority. And so all of these carry that connotation of military authority, legal authority, those kinds of things. And those are never used when in the New Testament when we talk about the function of what elders, shepherds do in their work in the church. And so we want to kind of get away from this idea that they do have some sort of legal, statutory, if you will, authority to carry out. So clearly Jesus has something entirely different in mind with regard to how it should be in the church. And so let's go now, let's see what the next one is. Begs the question then, what do elders exercise? What kind of authority is it? So Jesus, in this conversation then with the disciples, he said, this is the way it is here. That's not to be that way among you. So he says, but whoever would be great among you must be servant, and whoever would be first must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came to not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So Jesus kind of turned it upside down. This is what the world expects, but this is not the way it's going to be. In John 13, you remember the scene. It was after the Passover meal. And it's almost like a continuation of this conversation in Matthew 20 and Mark 10, where Jesus, I don't know, I'm going to take some liberties here and say, he says, I don't think they get it yet. I don't think they understand. And so now then at the Passover meal, then while the supper is going on, John writes this, during the supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. When he finished that, he said, do you understand what I did? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. So Jesus really kind of emphasized what he talked to them about in Mark 10 and in Matthew 20. He says, I really don't think you understand. And then he made the point with an object lesson that they really couldn't forget. Looking for servant leadership, not dictatorial, not statutory leadership. You're not something that's going to be like a king or a judge, if you will. Humility, love, and service were more important than power and authority. This is the quote from Ferguson's. This was first published, I think, I don't think, I know it is because I wrote it down. From an article he wrote, Authority and Tenure of Elders. It was published in 1975 in the Restoration Quarterly. He says, the most important kind possible in a Christian system, it's the moral authority of service, of example, of spiritual knowledge and experience, and spiritual maturity. That's why when Paul wrote to Timothy and Titus, those qualities he's looking for, someone who is above reproach, who's well thought of in the community, who knows how to manage his household well. All of those things that go to example, life. How are you living? You want somebody that's going to show you how to be, not somebody who's going to tell you how to be. And I get none of us, if we drove that to where we normally do, we go to extremes, right? There would be nobody ever qualified to be an elder. We could set that bar so high that, no, we need the perfect example. Well, that guy doesn't exist outside of Jesus. And so we need to be careful on how we apply these qualities, these qualifications that we read about there in Timothy and Titus. So it is an example that comes from unconditional love and humility. A shepherd that's able, willing to put the needs of the church, the needs of the flock, if you will, maybe even sometimes above his own, maybe all the time, who's able to be sacrificial. Yes, Betty?
A pretty well thing that we all need to practice in our life, especially humility. That gets me. I taught school many years. Even though they were children, I was an authority. And it got to where I kind of thought I was an authority in all of my life. And I found out that's not right. But most people have trouble with being humble. I
Yes.
do.
Yeah. What Betty's saying, you can hear, is that, correct me if I didn't get this quite right, but these are things that it's not just for our shepherds and our elders to do. This is something we all should take and live out. And she's exactly right. That's one of the ending conclusions that we have today, those foot stomper takeaways, is that this isn't just written to those who are or want to be shepherds and elders and deacons. Every single one of us needs to take these qualities into heart, and this is how we should live, because that's the way Christ lived. And so we want to be more and more Christ-like. I want to be more like Christ today than I was yesterday. Did I summarize that okay? Yeah. So that's exactly right. Is these aren't just written for our shepherds to take in note and say, okay, I got to be better at being humble. You know, they do, no doubt, but we also don't need to be giving out I'm the most humble person awards either. Once you put that on, you're kind of toasted. So Peter had this to say. He said, I exhort the elders among you as fellow elder in a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherding the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Let's go ahead and get to listen to this. And not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive an unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. It goes to what Betty's saying. All of us need to clothe ourselves with humility towards one another. That is our responsibility, and we are to be subject. We're supposed to submit, you know, and that's part of our responsibility anyway. You know, Paul writes, outdo one another in showing honor to one another, submit to one another, you know, out of love. There's so many of those one another scriptures that we could use to talk about that. Shepherding and exercising, let me back that up just a little bit. So shepherding the flock and exercising oversight, those are not passive activities. There are some things that are required. You've got to, as Louise said, there are some things you have to do to manage. You know, and does that look a little bit like at times maybe some aspect of business? Yeah, maybe. But that's not your focus. That's not what you're about, you know. And so one of the qualities there that we're looking for in shepherds and stuff is managing their own household well, okay? Well, it's the same word that we're told here, exercising oversight. It is managing. You know, how do you manage your household? How do you exercise oversight? How do you do these things if you have no authority at all? You are. But it also requires the other side of that aisle to be able to look out and be willing to submit, to subject to that moral authority, if you will, as we move along. So we don't need shepherds to necessarily tell us how to do or what to do, but to kind of lead by example to show us the things we need to do. Now that doesn't mean we sit back and watch them all the time, you know. Tommy, yeah.
Like in the case of Acts, where they delegated men to take care of the management or daily management type situation. Again, this is going to be my personal opinion, but elders have a lot more weighty things on their mind, worrying about the souls of their flocks, than making sure that you're checking the account is going good, or making sure that the utility bill is paid, or making sure that air conditioning system works. I've seen some of the better systems where the shepherds shepherd and were mainly concerned about the flock, and they delegated either the deacons. You can be in charge of maintenance. You can be in charge of this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
Find suitable people who have that skill of management or of being able to fix something in the correct spot. But relieve them in order to go out and do the more important thing of saving souls.
Exactly, and that's what they did in Acts when they appointed those 7 men. And what does Luke tell us happened after that? They could say, okay, you got it. I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to think about that anymore. The church grew. the church, you know, took off, if you will. And so when we follow that model, you know, we don't have to have a lot of church growth seminars. We just do it God's way and let Him take care of the growth. We don't need to spend a lot of effort and money trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to do to bring people in from next door, you know? Do the right things, they'll come. So especially He wants us to put on that towel of service as we continue on. And of course, Peter encourages everyone, not just the elders, clothe yourselves with humility. So, what do you want? What kind of authority do you want to see exercised in the eldership here in Fort Walton Beach? Some thoughts? Not? Okay.
Positive leadership and a plan to go forward to save souls. I think that's something that
Okay.
we would all want.
Say that one more time.
I think we want a positive, Bible-based leadership with a plan to feed flock and save souls.
Okay. Positive, Bible-based, with a plan or a vision, if you will, to go out there and do the task we've been asked to do. It is to teach, preach the gospel, to bring in to win souls. Right? Okay. Okay, Betty. Just a second. That's all I can hear right now.
That we first of all need to examine ourselves often.
Yep.
To find out what we are doing and what we're not doing. And then you can come up with dealing with what he's saying.
Yeah.
But if you just get out there and live like I've kind of been living in a recliner with a remote, you're just not measuring up.
Yeah. So we do need to look at ourselves and say, okay, what are my talents? What are my gifts? What can I be doing? Yeah. And we want leaders that do that too. But we also, when we do that and we say, okay, I have this talent, but, somebody else will do that. Oh, of course. And you'll see that in any eldership. I know you'll see that here is not all our elders are carbon copies of one another. Some of them are better at some things than others. And so we should play to our strengths. We should use those talents, those gifts in the best way possible. And so should we as members, is that if I see something that needs to be done, and I think, okay, I could do that, I need to charge in there and do it. Sometimes I don't need to wait for permission. Just do it and, yep.
You're talking about filling things that elders should have, and you were saying letters from children.
Yeah.
I have been to congregations where the children had no idea who the elder was, and had no interaction with the elders whatsoever.
Right.
I know that we have elders in this particular church that if there's a football game that's got our little Christians in it, he's there.
Yeah.
If they've got band practice, he's there.
Right.
And in my opinion, I think that the youngsters actually know that no matter what they do, even at a younger age, they have an elder there that will always be there and will support and watch what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think things like that are just totally crucial. Getting out and being with your flock instead of being in the barn with the salmon.
Because the message is going on. What Tom is saying is our children sometimes are, they're always aware when people are at their events. And so we have eldership here that is, I think, engaged with children. We should know our children better. All of us. I'm ashamed to say I don't know all our kids' names. Wow, they grow up so fast. But we do need to be more engaged, because what it shows is I care. And so it doesn't matter the age. If you're engaged enough to make contact, it shows that you care, that you want to be an example. And sometimes being there when someone just needs a little bit of encouragement is that's so important. To be that person that says, I care about you, and I want you to know that I care. Because God cares, Yep.
And I'm not saying, I think our eldership, it falls in line with this real well, but, being prayerful and godly in the leadership roles. And I think it's wonderful elder but in that respect, but I think that's the principle, found in relying on God, being always prayerful and trying to be godly and letting the Lord direct our path.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
He's the leader.
Yeah. David, did you have some? Can you just put your okay. All right. So to sum things up, and that is the authority that our elders have, and the authority that our elders exercise is that authority that comes from their example, their service, their life, if you will. Do they have that delegated stuff from the chief shepherd to take care of the management? Sure. If you think about the parable of the good steward, right, or the guy that took care of the vineyard, while his owner was away. That's kind of what the elders are responsible for. As the manager of the vineyard, as the keeper, that you have some responsibility to make sure it stays on track, to make sure things are moving in the right direction. Do you own the flock? Do you own the vineyard? No, but you are directed to, okay, tend my sheep. That's what Jesus told Peter, right? Take care of my flock. And so that's the end of class. Thank you for your comments and participation.